I'd now like to explain the historical origin of the concept of dichotomous afterlife. Those of you who are familiar with the Christian Bible know that the idea of afterlife is a New Testament concept, but not an Old Testament concept. The most familiar story to me is how Jacob mourned the evident loss of his favorite son Joseph, declaring that he didn't want to go to his grave, losing his other favorite son, Benjamin, as well. Jacob had no idea that he would go to heaven and see Joseph or Benjamin in heaven, because he had no idea of afterlife. Even at the time of Christ, we see in the New Testament that the Sadducees did not believe in the afterlife, while the Pharisees did. Why do we have this difference? Because the Sadducees were the priests of Judaism, so they were conservative, strictly adhering to Old Testament teaching, which didn't include afterlife. By contrast, the Pharisees were a lay movement, open to new ideas, and they adopted the idea that there is an afterlife of heaven and hell, and that a person needs to obtain salvation to avoid ending up in hell. As we can see in the New Testament, by the time of Christ this idea had become popular among the Jewish masses, and Jesus himself espoused the idea. The Apostle Paul was a Pharisee, so naturally he held to the idea, and it became part of Christianity. But where did the idea of dichotomous afterlife come from? We infer from the historical records that the idea originated in Zoroastrianism, which is a Persian religion that goes back at least to the 500s before Christ. Most people aren't familiar with Zoroastrianism today because when the Muslim warriors from Arabia conquered Persia in the 600s, they were intolerant of Zoroastrianism, considering it to be a false religion. So many Zoroastrians fled from Persia. Since the Arabs came from the west, the Zoroastrians had to flee east, where they found refuge in India. Zoroaster conceived of a grand cosmic vision of the world, in which the one true God, who is the only real God, has a cosmic antagonist, and the goal of a human is to honor God through worship and virtuous living, thereby shunning the temptations and the falsehoods of God's antagonist. When a person dies, they will end up in paradise, which is Persian for garden, if they have sufficiently honored God. Otherwise, they will end up in the lake of fire. If you're familiar with ancient history, you know that the Babylonians conquered Judah in the early 500s before Christ, and then the Persians under Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon a few decades later. The Persians went on to conquer what today we call the Middle East or the Near East. The Persian Empire founded by Cyrus was a first great empire of the region, and it set the standard for the later empires of Alexander the Great and Rome. As a result of the Persian Empire, Zoroastrian concepts were spread throughout the Near East, exposing everyone to Zoroaster's grand cosmic concepts of monotheism and dichotomous afterlife. In my book, I discuss the technical issue of how direct the influence of Zoroastrianism on Judaism may have been. In any case, Judaism was ripe for influence from Zoroastrianism, as we can see from the Despair of Ecclesiastes, which is a book in the Judaic Bible or Christian Old Testament. In the first chapter of Ecclesiastes, the writer laments that life is meaningless, and this chapter has given rise to a number of famous phrases along these lines. One phrase is, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." Another phrase is that there is nothing new under the sun. Another is the title of Ernest Hemingway's first major novel, "The Sun Also Rises." Yet another is the title of one of Elie Wiesel's books of memoirs, "All Rivers Run to the Sea." I invite you to pause the video at the next slide and answer the question as to why Ecclesiastes expresses despair, that life is meaningless. In chapter 2, the writer of Ecclesiastes asked, what is the use of rising to the height of material success, and what is the use of gaining wisdom? The writer concludes that all is vanity and chasing after wind. Why? Because the same fate befalls all. Whether rich or poor, whether wise or foolish, the same fate befalls all. This is the reason for the despair of Ecclesiastes. So now I invite you to pause the video again on the next slide and explain why Judaism was ripe for influence from Zoroastrianism. The reason that Judaism was ripe for influence from Zoroastrianism is that Zoroastrianism provided the concept of dichotomous afterlife, and this solves the problem expressed in Ecclesiastes. The idea of dichotomous afterlife provides two complementary ideas that solve the problem of Ecclesiastes. The first idea is the concept that there is an afterlife, while the second idea is the concept of the dichotomy, that there are two places in the afterlife, not just one. Recall that the writer of Ecclesiastes laments that the same fate befalls all. Whether rich or poor, whether wise or foolish, the same fate befalls all. But with dichotomous afterlife, the same fate doesn't befall all, for there are two possible afterlife destinies, paradise versus the lake of fire. So now if I work hard to be virtuous, I can look forward to an ultimate reward in paradise, while liars, cheaters, thieves, and adulterers will also get their due reward. They'll end up in the lake of fire. As I said before, in Judaism, the conservative Sadducees rejected this newfangled idea of dichotomous afterlife. But some Judaic intellectuals adopted it, and these intellectuals became the Pharisees of Jesus' time. And as I mentioned earlier, by the time of Christ, this idea had become popular among the Jewish laity, and Jesus himself espoused the idea. The Apostle Paul was a Pharisee, so naturally he held to the idea, and it became part of Christianity. Let's summarize. In this video on heaven and hell, we've seen why the idea of dichotomous afterlife is irrational. And we've seen that the origin of the idea in Western religion lies in Zoroastrianism. The word paradise is Persian for garden. So whenever you see heaven referred to as paradise, you're seeing the original Persian term for the idea. This occurs a few times in the New Testament.